Last month, I visited Nappy Roots Bookstore, Oklahoma City's only Black-owned bookstore, and purchased a copy of Angie Thomas's 2017 debut novel, The Hate U Give. This book was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. I didn't know anything about the story at the time, but once I started it, I finished the 464-page novel in 2 days. It's a story about a chasm which exists between Black and white America. The first version of the novel was a short story that the author wrote during college in reaction to the police shooting of 22-year-old Oscar Grant on New Year's Day in 2009 in Oakland, California. I lived in Oakland, California in 2009 on New Year's Day. I vividly remember this shooting, the news cycle, the protests, the uprising. The book is about a 16-year-old girl, Star Carter, who moves between two worlds, the poor neighborhood where she lives, which in the book is called the ghetto. And when she was 10 years old, she witnessed her best friend's death in a drive-by shooting. And so then her parents, for her own safety, have her go to a school 45 minutes away in the white, preppy, mostly suburb area of town. So this character moves between these two worlds. At the beginning of the book, she and her childhood friend are leaving a party. They're in a car. They get pulled over by a police officer, and she witnesses her friend, who is unarmed, be shot by the police officer. There was maybe a hairbrush in the car door that the police officer thought could have been a gun. This is the beginning of the story. What usually happens when you're reading a book or watching a movie or even viewing police body cam videos is that you will find yourself trying to identify with one of the characters in the book or the movie, in the video, the situation. When reading the book, are you the main character who now must testify in front of a grand jury, hoping that your words can bring some sort of justice to the memory of your innocent friend? Are you the police officer, raised as we all are in a systemically racist culture that teaches us implicit bias against Black and brown folk and for white and light-skinned folk? Are you the main character's parents, trying to protect your teenage daughter from further trauma? Are you the white friends from the prep school who think they have no personal connection for why this police shooting death even matters? In today's gospel story entitled The Rich Man and Lazarus, we also get to wonder which character we will most identify with. Like in the novel, this parable is about a chasm, a gate that divides and separates certain people in our society. Leading up to this parable, the author of Luke has been pretty hard-hitting when it comes to stories and teachings about riches and wealth. Just to name a few, I think 6 is how many I'm going to name. Luke 12:13 through 15. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replied, "Watch out. Be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Luke 12:16 through 20. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "I'm going to tear down all my barns and build bigger ones. I'm going to store my surplus there." And God said, "You fool, you're going to die tonight. What's going to happen to all that you've prepared for yourself?" Luke 12:34. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Luke 14:12 through 14. When you give a dinner, don't invite your friends or relatives or rich people, but invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Finally, Luke 18:22. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and then come and follow me. The point is, Jesus in the Gospel of Luke mentions riches and wealth at least a time or two. So in this story about the rich man and Lazarus, we are introduced to the only character in any of Jesus's parables who is given a name, at least in the Gospel of Luke. Say his name, #Lazarus. We start off with a description of the rich man who is dressed in purple and who feasted splendidly every day. I found out this week that I'm getting cash back on my tax return, and I have a lot of purple clothing, and I cooked some delicious meals this week. So I begin by identifying with the rich man in this story. Of course, in those times, purple dye and cloth was expensive and could have signified royalty. But anyway, you identify yourself with someone depending on who you are comparing and contrasting yourself with. So if I compare myself to billionaires, I look more like Lazarus in this story. But if I compare myself to most of the rest of the world, I do look like the rich man. So in Act 1 of this parable, we are introduced to the first chasm, a gate that separates the rich man's estate from the beggar Lazarus, who is covered in sores and longs to eat the leftover scraps from the rich man's table. Lest you think that gated communities are a modern day invention, notice this gated community in the Gospel of Luke. Wanting to distance from those considered unsightly has a long and lengthy history. Act 2, Lazarus dies first. We don't know if it was due to a lack of affordable health care or starvation or freezing to death during a winter storm, but we do know that he had no money for a proper burial. So instead, angels came and carried him into the arms of Sarah and Abraham. Next, the rich man dies. We don't know if his death was due to refusing to wear a mask during a global pandemic or a heart attack, or if he died of natural causes at a ripe old age, but he was able to afford a proper funeral and probably was buried with a large headstone inside a gated cemetery. Act 3. Luke's famous theme of reversals comes into play. Mary and her Magnificat began this trend of reversal in the first chapter of Luke. She praises God, saying, "You have brought down the powerful from their thrones, and you have lifted up the lowly. You have filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." The chasm and gated community persist in the afterlife, but instead of Lazarus being on the outside of comfort and luxury, now he is well off, and the rich man's circumstances have been reversed, and he lies in torment. To the original listeners of this parable, this reversal would have been shocking. Folks tended to believe back then that blessings in this life were a sign of God's favor, and hardship in this life was a sign of God's displeasure. But really, don't we still think this way today? If someone is poor or without, it must be because of something they did. They probably deserve or earned their suffering, and vice versa. The things we possess now are probably because we earned them fair and square, and others should have just worked as hard as we have. It's at this point in the story we see the error of the rich man. It wasn't that he never noticed Lazarus when they were both alive. To the contrary, he even knew Lazarus's name. It was that he never made an effort to cross the chasm which divided these two in life. And now the chasm has become impenetrable in death. It takes thought and effort and energy to cross a chasm. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached on this text, and as some scholars do, he referred to the rich man. The rich man doesn't have a name in the gospel, but the Latin word for riches is dives. And so Dr. King calls the rich man dives. So this is what Dr. King said, quote, "Dives is the white man who refuses to cross the gulf of segregation and lift his Negro brother to the position of first-class citizenship because he thinks segregation is part of the fixed structure of the universe. Dives is the India Brahmin who refuses to bridge the gulf between himself and his brother because he feels that the gulf which is set forth by the caste system is a final principle of the universe. Dives is the American capitalist who never seeks to bridge the economic gulf between himself and the laborer because he feels that it is natural for some to live in an inordinate luxury while others live in abject poverty. Dives' sin was not that he was cruel to Lazarus, but that he refused to bridge the gap of misfortune that existed between them. Dive's sin was not his wealth. His wealth was his opportunity. His sin was his refusal to use his wealth to bridge the gulf between the extremes of superfluous, inordinate wealth and abject, deadening poverty. So when Dives cries to Abraham to send him one drop of water at Lazarus's hands, Abraham replies, "There is a fixed gulf between you now." There was a time that Dives could have bridged the gulf. He could have used the engineering power of love to build a bridge of compassion between him and Lazarus, but he refused, and now the gulf is fixed. End quote. Once the rich man understands that the chasm, the gulf, the gated community is now set in this afterlife parable, for the first time he finally thinks of someone else besides himself. He wants to warn those in his household to do better than he did. Granted, he wants Lazarus to be his errand boy and deliver the message, but Sarah and Abraham will reply, "Those in your household have Moses and the prophets. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be convinced even if someone should rise from the dead." It's here in Act 3 that we can stop wondering if we're more like the rich man or more like Lazarus. Because the truth is, in this story, we are most like those who are still alive in the household, the ones the rich man wants to warn. And the question Jesus leaves us with is this: will we listen to the wisdom and teachings of Moses and the prophets? Will we cross the chasms of today which separate and divide? Or will we accept them as fixed structures in our universe? 2 Mondays ago, I sat in Ebenezer Baptist Church with other community leaders to watch the 5 body cam videos and 1 surveillance video recording of the shooting death of 15-year-old Stavian Rodriguez last November by 6 Oklahoma City police officers. Earlier that week, the body cam video of the shooting death of Benny Edwards had been released. I watched it online. The Oklahoma City Police Department has the second highest rate of police killings per population from 2013 to 2020. We only come in second underneath the city of St. Louis. There is a chasm of injustice and violence that must be crossed, which will require much thought, effort, and energy. Our current situation is not a fixed structure of the universe that is supposed to stay that way. We saw a lot of chasms that need to be crossed this week in Oklahoma. Oklahoma State Representative Brad Bowles, 37, claims he had a slip of the tongue while discussing a bill which would deny women their choice and autonomy of their body. As he unpacked his argument, he referred to Black children as colored babies, hearkening back to the Jim Crow South. Then last Wednesday, the Oklahoma House passed a bill that grants civil and criminal immunity for drivers who unintentionally injure or kill protesters while, quote, fleeing from a riot. House Bill 1674 is just one of a handful of bills this year designed to crack down on protests. This bill was brought up for a vote around 12:30 a.m. after more than 14 hours of voting on legislation in order to avoid public scrutiny. Then, at a routine Thursday night high school basketball game, Norman High players knelt during the national anthem, a right protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Matt Rowan, the sports announcer of the event, could be heard on video playback mocking and degrading young women, calling them effing N-words. Rowan issued a statement the following day claiming he is not a racist and that his type 1 diabetes had a part to play in his choice of words. The need for chasm crossing is the takeaway from today's gospel. And there are no shortages of chasms which need to be crossed in our personal lives, in the public arena, and in our world. My favorite part of Dr. King's sermon about the rich man and Lazarus was when he said that the rich man's sin is not his wealth, but that his wealth was his opportunity. Not all of us have the opportunity of wealth to work with, but some of us do. Some of us have the opportunity of time, and some of us have the opportunity of platform and voice. Funds, time, platform, and voice were all utilized over the past few years to cross the chasm of injustice, which exists in the Julius Jones case, a man who has been on death row for over 2 decades for a murder he did not commit. This week, all the thought, effort, and energy that was gone into this crossing of the chasm of injustice paid off when the Oklahoma City Pardon and Parole Board voted to grant Julius Jones a second clemency hearing. We are hopeful and prayerful that one day Julius will be released from prison. This week, when you read the books, when you watch the movies, when you see the videos, when you hear the gospel, I hope you find yourself in the story as one who heeds the wisdom of the prophets, as one who listens to the love of Jesus, as one who uses your wealth, your time, your voice as an opportunity to cross the chasms. May it be so. Amen.